Noswaith dda y croeso cynnes iawn I chi gyd. Good evening and a very, very warm welcome to you all. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here for another instalment in our distinguished alumni lecture series. It's great to have you with us. And I'm also delighted to extend a very, very warm welcome this evening to Dr. George Buckley, a friend and former student of Bangor University. George graduated from this university in 1993 in economics, and since then he's kept very close ties with us, supporting a wide range of endeavours. He visits our business school regularly, sharing his knowledge and expertise with our students and prospective students, and he provides valuable advice around choosing a career. In 2015, George took on the role of chair of our Alumni Advisory Board, a position that speaks volumes about his dedication to our community. Through this role, he advocates for the interests of our alumni, providing invaluable guidance to the institution, and I'm really, really grateful for his ongoing support. George's contributions to the field of economics are significant. As the chief UK economist at Nomura and previously at Deutsche Bank, his insights have shaped the discourse surrounding the economic landscape. His book, What You Need to Know About Economics, is a testament to his ability to offer clarity in the often complex field of economic theory. This evening, George will guide us through the post-pandemic economic landscape, deciphering the subtle shifts that have emerged, whilst also exploring the complexities of fiscal policy in the light of the upcoming UK election. His economist viewpoint is both distinct and enlightening, offering us an opportunity to deepen our understanding of these crucial issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming George to the university. We're really, really looking forward to the lecture, George. Thank you. Theo. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming. It's great to be here and back in this lecture theatre where I spent many a happy, sometimes confused hours. It's certainly changed since I was here. It definitely wasn't this pink, as far as I can remember. It's wonderful to be here, but and it's, of course, the university's 140th anniversary this year, and it made me think, and after what you said, Edmund, how long it is since I was actually at this university. And last year was the 30th anniversary of me leaving this university and the 25th anniversary of me starting a career in the city. And it also made me think about some of the things which are the same and some of the things which are different about Bangor now relative to when I was here. I'm very pleased to see that the teaching standards are still exceptional. I was looking at some of the teacher satisfaction ratings and some of the league tables, and they were up there with the top 10 universities in the country, which I think is testimony to what I certainly remember about this university when I was here and what it is today. Then there's Pontio, of course, which wasn't here when I was here. This is definitely an improvement for anyone who remembers the student union as it was beforehand. It's not really that new any longer. I think is it 10 years next year that it was built, 2015? So that's definitely a big improvement, and of course it's a fantastic bridge in more than one sense between the university and the town. And then I'm thrilled to say that the nightclub is still here and in exactly the same place as it was when I was here. It wasn't called Trilogy back then, it was called the Octagon. And it also, because of Welsh licensing laws, finished at 12:15. There are people in my office who work with me, substantially younger than I am, who probably won't even go out until 12:15, never mind get thrown out of the club at 12:15. And then, of course, there is Glanravon Hill and Monpobty, which look still just as steep as they ever did do when I was here. I was actually looking at a couple of threads recently online, and there were some people saying, had I known it was going to be that steep a hill, I wouldn't have come here. But I presume he meant to St Mary's rather than Bangor altogether. They should probably know that it's quite a mountainous region. This is also, I think, the largest ever presentation I've ever seen on this screen. So this is fantastic. Hopefully you can all see it well and hear me all right. What I'm going to do, I wanted to speak about a few things today. And I'm going to spend about half an hour, 35 minutes or so, and then we can open it up to Q&A. But I thought what I'd do is look at 5 interesting topics that economists in the city are absolutely fascinated by at the moment. And the first one is a bit of a here and now, where we're at. How has the recovery gone on so far since 2019, since the pandemic? And then the second thing is just to look a little bit further afield and how is economic growth developing in the longer term? Are we optimistic about where we might be in 10 years' time, or are we pessimistic? And then inflation. I mean, this has been such a huge problem, of course, over the last few years for every developed and also emerging markets. So I thought it'd be useful to see where do we expect inflation to settle. And then fourth, how do central banks make their economic forecasts for things like economic growth and inflation? And I wanted to finish off with where do we think interest rates will settle? Because, of course, that's important. Whether you're a saver or a borrower, it's important to know that. So I wanted to start off by just looking at how economies have recovered since the pandemic. Now, one of the problems, of course, in looking at economic growth right now is that the recorded level of GDP growth is probably exaggerating what we are seeing from underlying economic growth. And I'll explain that in a second, but before we do, I just wanted to show you this very large table of numbers. You might think that's quite daunting, but the numbers I want to focus on are on the top line. Now, for anybody who's studied economics before, and I'm not sure how I use this little button, here we go, down the left-hand side, you'll probably notice that these are the elements of GDP. We've got consumer spending, investment, government spending, exports and imports. And along the top line, we have the level of GDP relative to where it was in the quarter before the pandemic started. So relative to where it was in Q4 2019. And what's interesting about this is that have a look at Germany and the UK and compare them to the US. Germany is pretty much flat. They've seen 0 growth versus the UK, which has only seen 1% economic growth over the past 4 years. Not very much at all. The US, on the other hand, has grown by over 8%, and consumer spending in the US has grown by more than 10%. And I think that's probably testimony to the fact that when the US got into this pandemic crisis, they provided a lot of checks to people who were going to spend them, to people who were on low incomes or medium incomes, who had very high marginal propensities to consume. People got those checks, they didn't put them in the bank, they spent them. That wasn't quite the same across Europe, where the amount of excess savings that people saw in their bank accounts increased quite substantially. So very, very different pattern, I think, as you can see, of economic output relative to where we were. Now, why is it important to look at economic output now and compare it to where it was pre-pandemic? And I think the reason for this is shown in this chart. Now, I'm not sure if you can see that, but they're all sort of suitcases and aeroplanes representing numbers of holidays that one might take during the year. So it's a very simple bit of maths, but if you took, I'm not sure who does take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holidays a year, maybe that's a bit excessive. But imagine you took 5 holidays a year in 2019. 2020, you took maybe 1, if you were lucky, maybe at the very start of the year before the pandemic hit. That's an 80% drop in the number of holidays. And then imagine you start to see it recover again over subsequent years. These numbers show the percentage growth rates of your number of holidays. It's absolutely huge. Now imagine applying that to every aspect of economic life since the pandemic. What you're seeing is catch-up growth. So GDP growth in 2023 was strong, not because, and it wasn't even that strong, but it was strong simply because we were seeing catch-up economic growth. One interesting feature of my life is that I had not taken a foreign holiday with my family since the pandemic until December of 2023. And I thought, if everyone does the same thing, you can imagine a situation where catch-up growth would be quite significant. and almost overestimating what the underlying rate of economic growth was. And I should just say, by the way, that the reason that I didn't take a holiday till then is because I have a 4-year-old child who I would not have wanted to take on an airplane with a plane packed full of people because he's so annoying. Anyway, that's a different matter. But the point is that you can see how this catch-up growth works. And therefore, whenever you look at economic growth, and even in the UK, economic growth was actually negative in the second half of 2023. That's a really important point because it would have been even worse had it not been for this catch-up. And some countries have done a lot better than others. I mean, this chart shows this very clearly. This is the evolution of economic forecasts for the UK, for Germany, for the euro area, and for the US. And what's very clear is that back in the middle of 2023, the expectation for US economic growth was just 0.5%. That expectation now is about 2 and a bit percent. In fact, our own economic forecasters based in New York on the US think it's going to be about 2.5%. So they are even more positive than consensus. Whereas on the other hand, expectations for growth in Europe have slid. They've fallen very substantially. So depending on which country you're looking at, some countries are doing much better than others, some countries are doing a lot worse. And there's some reasons for that. I think this chart really illustrates the issue of Germany, which is doing particularly badly. This chart shows where industrial production is relative to where it was pre-pandemic, so January 2020. Germany is 9% lower, so German manufacturing output 9% lower than where it was back in early 2020. And some countries doing a lot better. So Spain is now showing slightly higher output relative to where we were pre-pandemic. And I think Germany is a particularly special case. There are various reasons which I've listed here for why Germany is not doing so well. Probably one of the major ones is that Germany was exposed to such low-cost gas through the German-Russian pipeline that by the time they moved from that to imported liquefied natural gas, the cost of that is so much higher relative to what they were importing through the pipeline that this was a huge price shock, a huge energy price shock, which meant that businesses were unable to operate in the way that they were beforehand. They had to adjust to this big price shock. Another issue is China exposure. Now, Germany is much more exposed to China than any other country in Europe. Around about 3% of its GDP each year is traded with China. So they export 3% of output every year to China. Now, you might not think that 3% is a very large number. But when you compare it to most other European economies, you're looking at between 0.5 and 1%. So China is much more important for Germany than the rest of Europe. And then there's the scale of its manufacturing sector. Germany's manufacturing sector is worth about 30% of its GDP. That's what the UK manufacturing sector used to be worth in the 1970s. It's now worth about 10. So that gives some perspective. It's about 3 times larger than what the UK is. We've already seen how weak German consumption has been. We are seeing a fiscal tightening going on in Germany just to abide with their electoral laws. They have to reduce their fiscal spending to be in line with those. We've seen strikes, we've seen a weak housing market, and demographics, which I'll come on to, a really key issue here. But the good news is that it doesn't matter where you are, the expectation of economic growth is getting better. And so you can see that from this chart here, which shows it's a survey which is conducted by Bloomberg every so often, and they ask questions about what's the likelihood of different economies going into recession. And you can see all of those are trending down. So expectations of recession have receded, which is very good news indeed. So that's pretty much where we are now. I would say things are looking brighter. They're still concerning in some countries, but things are definitely looking better. So I think probably what's more interesting than looking at where we are right now relative to pre-pandemic is to give some sort of sense of how things are evolving relative to, over the next maybe 5 to 10 years or so. And so what is the outlook for longer term economic growth? And once again, you can look at what economists think is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. You might not believe them, but it's worth looking at where you think things are going to go. And this is a survey which is done by a group called Consensus Forecast. They ring up or email economists and ask them to say where they think growth is going to be in 5 to 10 years. Now, with the best will in the world, nobody can forecast the economic cycle in 5 to 10 years' time. So all of these numbers must be what economists think is trend economic growth, where they think it's going to settle. So it's quite a helpful exercise. Now, I think two things are immediately obvious from this chart. Number one is that economies are not expected to grow anywhere near as strongly as they did back in 2007, or at least what economists thought they would grow in 2007. The US, for example, was expected to grow in 5 or 10 years' time back in 2007 at about 3%. So economists thought that by 2012 to 2017, that's 5 to 10 years later, the economy will be growing at about 3%. They now think that in 5 to 10 years from now, it's going to be about 1.8. So much, much weaker. That's the first thing. And this has happened to every economy. It's not just the UK it's everywhere. The second point is that if you look at the point of here, 2016, the biggest fall out of all of these lines has been the UK. And I think personally that is probably, and this is not a political statement, I think personally it's probably related to the fact that economists think that Brexit is going to be negative for long-term economic growth. And just to give you a sense of that, the Bank of England thinks that GDP will be about or productivity will be about 3.5% lower by the end of its forecast horizon because of Brexit. So that is one interesting aspect of this particular chart. The second reason why we might see weaker economic growth is because of what's happening to populations, what's happening to demographics. This chart shows the evolution of dependency ratios. And dependency ratios are described as people who are of non-working age relative to people of working age. And I should be actually telling this to my kids that they should be expecting to get into the labour force quite early, because the United Nations believes that anything over 15 should be classified as working age, which might be a bit outrageous, but the point is that when this goes up, it means you've got more people who are not working relative to the people who are working in the economy. And what the bars show are the first three years of the 2020s. All the red bars show forecasts for the rest. And I think what you can see is for most countries, there is a clear trend here, which is either that dependency ratios are going up, so more people of non-working age compared to working age, or they are very high in the first place. The ones that are going up very quickly are, for example, Germany. The one which is very high in the first place is Japan. There is only one country there where we are seeing populations grow, and in this case here, dependency ratios falling, which is good news, which is India. And of course, they are undergoing at the moment probably the largest global democratic exercise in history, which is 970 million people voting over the course of the next 6 weeks for their general election. The problem with an aging population is that, well, there's two issues. First of all, if you have more people who are of non-working age relative to working age, it means that two things happen. First of all, you have lower productivity growth. And secondly, you have higher demand pressures on supply. Because a lot of the people who are not working will still be consuming, but you now have fewer people who are actually producing the stuff in the first place. So you have more limited supply, similar demand, which means that there is a potential for inflation to be even stronger. And that's obviously a worry for central banks. Another point and another negative, I think, and don't worry, they're not all going to be negatives. I think there are some positives in here at some point. But China is no longer growing at the rate it used to. China used to be a big support to the global economy, but now not quite as much. Now, I think we would all take growth rates of 4% in Europe right now. But in China, that is very, very low indeed. They have been used to growth rates of double digits in the past. But now we're looking at growth rates which are much, much slower. And our forecasts are that they will grow around about 4% over the next couple of years versus as you can see, back in the mid-2000s, well into double digits. 3 reasons for that. Pent-up demand, as I was talking about before, post-pandemic, is now not quite as strong as it used to be. So we've started to see the rise in growth, the catch-up growth, slow down a bit. Secondly, we have a property crisis in China. The property market is doing pretty badly right now. And thirdly, there are lots of external challenges as well. The global economy is not growing as quickly as we thought it would. And I just wanted to talk also about the rates of economic growth that we might expect to see in the UK. This chart comes from the Bank of England from its monetary policy report, which it published back in February. And what it shows is that the pink bars there show potential productivity growth, which you can see is much, much slower than the rates that we saw between 1997 and 2007 before the global financial crisis. And they are slowing to below their long-run rate. Let me just explain why Brexit might be one of the reasons that could actually displace productivity. And that is because openness is being damaged. And we describe openness as the amount of trade that a country does relative to the size of that country, typically measured as exports plus imports and divided by GDP. So it gives some sort of sense of how open an economy is. And the problem with that is when you have lower openness and lower trade, you have lower rates of innovation, you have lower rates of specialization. And these issues go really to the heart of, the foundation principles of the subject of economics. Adam Smith, for example, used his example of the pin factory back in The Wealth of Nations in 1776 to talk about the fact that the division of labor is very helpful in producing stronger growth outcomes. And of course, if you don't have that division of labor across countries, you are going to see slower economic growth. David Ricardo, back in the early 1800s, also had a similar conclusion, which is that countries benefit by making stuff. Even if they can't make it as well as other countries, the theory of comparative advantage tells you that the more you trade, the greater the productivity benefits are going to be. So these are really important things. If you see slower trade and you will see also slower growth as well. So that's really the end of the bad stuff. I wanted to just focus on 2 positives. This is a chart of productivity. It just shows how it has slowed. But I think there are 2 things that could potentially be quite big wins for the global economy going forward. The first is AI, artificial intelligence. Now, the Bank of England did a survey which said that 30% of firms last year were significantly investing in AI. So that's obviously quite important. There have been various studies, particularly by McKinsey, by Goldman Sachs, which estimated a huge range of possible outcomes for the impact of productivity on GDP growth. So large that I think both McKinsey and Goldman said that the range of possible outcomes on the annual rate of GDP growth of technology could be anywhere between 0.2% per year and 3% per year. Now, 3% a year is absolutely huge. One of my concerns is that I have seen precisely how my kids use AI and the stuff that they watch on their iPads, and my conclusion might be it could be even negative for productivity, but that's a different matter. But most businesses do expect that this is going to be positive for productivity over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. And the second one is climate change. Now, it might not be immediately obvious that this is going to be positive for productivity. In fact, it might even be negative for productivity over the first couple of years, because net zero will necessitate that some firms have to move their productive assets away from what they're using them right now for and instead into net zero. So this might not be positive to start with, But as it reduces the cost of energy in the long term, I think it could end up being very positive indeed. So I think there's a lot of uncertainties about where economic growth goes. There are a lot of negatives, but I think there are some positives which are obviously coming on the scene now, which we really just don't know how much of an impact they're going to have, but I suspect that they will be positive. So the third thing I wanted to turn my attention to was inflation. And there's a big debate in the city right now, which is, are we going to go back to the pre-pandemic norm, which is inflation running at levels which are too low, central banks unable to push inflation back up to their target rates? Or is this a new regime? Are we in a regime where inflation is actually going to be really difficult to get back down to target? And I just wanted to show you a couple of charts to begin with. This is the first one. It shows US inflation momentum. And I would say beware when you look at annual rates of inflation, how much prices have increased relative to a year ago, because that can be influenced by two things. First of all, how prices are moving right now, but even more, or just as importantly, how they moved a year ago. If you saw a big rise in prices 1 year ago, then right now, if they rise by a normal amount, your year-on-year rate will collapse. And that's exactly what we've been seeing over the last year. Prices rising at a more normal rate than it was doing a year ago, which meant that the year-on-year rate falls very sharply. So I think it's very important to bear that in mind. And that's why economists like to look at momentum in prices, looking at the monthly change in prices, not the yearly change in prices. And maybe taking a 3-month moving average, but certainly looking at where that's moving. You can see that we got back down to target just about on some measures of inflation, but we bounced back again. So we're now looking at inflation rates which are rising again, and that is a little bit unnerving. That's a chart for the US. I can show you pretty much exactly the same thing for Europe as well. These 4 charts show, first of all, inflation in the top left quadrant. This is core inflation, which strips out things like energy, food, and alcohol. This is services inflation, and this is core goods. And what's worrisome is this chart down here. And what this chart shows is services prices, and they are starting to rise again, and they have not really fallen back to where they should go. I often think about these last mile risks, as they call them, as it's a bit like my golf game. Now, my golf game, I have to say, is not very good. I can quite happily go around a course and take 120 shots, which is pretty poor. I can see anyone who laughs at you, you're obviously a golfer. Clearly, I'm not. The problem is, if you start off at 120 shots, it's pretty easy to take 10 shots off your score. Just like if you start off at 10% inflation, it's pretty easy to halve it to 5%. What's not so easy is to get down to 90 shots, and every shot you take off your score at that point is a lot more difficult. And I think that's where we've got to right now, which is inflation has got down again to normal levels or just above normal levels. But the really crucial thing for central banks is they've got to get it back to the 2% inflation target. And right now, all of these charts are telling us that they are not managing that. So they need to use monetary policy to bring it down to more normal levels. Then you can ask economists, do you think that central banks eventually will be able to get inflation down to normal levels? And the answer is, well, for some economies like Japan, they might actually struggle to get inflation up to normal levels. You can see from the line at the bottom that economists think that inflation in Japan in 5 to 10 years will be 1.3%, which is below the target. Whereas for countries like the UK and the US, they're going to struggle to get it back down to 2. Now, you might not think that 0.2 percentage points difference from target, which is 2%, is very much. But over a 5 to 10 year period, that suggests that central banks are not able to do their job. Because it means that if you ask 100 economists, that means that some of them are going to say, yes, they'll get it back to target. Others will say, no, I think they're going to go below. But some people think that it's going to be well above. And I think this is a real challenge for central banks to be able to use monetary policy to bring inflation back to target successfully. I just wanted to show you a chart which, just to point out the bottom axis here, this goes to 2007. So I wanted to show you a period before the global financial crisis. What did inflation look like then? The headline rate of inflation is that sort of orangey line, and it ended up around about 2%. It wasn't too far off. But what made up inflation? Well, it was very different, because what you had was a period of outright deflation in goods. And the reason that happened is because people were buying so much stuff each year extra from low-cost economies that goods prices every single year were falling. Imagine keep buying more and more stuff from an economy which is selling it to you more and more cheaply, and every year you had deflation in goods. Your goods were getting cheaper every single year. The top line shows services inflation. So this is domestically generated inflation. It's the stuff that's homegrown. Now you might think, wow, that's pretty high. And it was high, but the reason being is because the central bank saw deflation in half of the basket in goods prices and said, what can we do about this? Well, we have to achieve an inflation target of 2%. So the only thing we can do is run monetary policy too loose to generate higher services inflation to offset the goods price deflation which is coming from abroad. And that's exactly what the central banks did in the run-up to the global financial crisis. And you could argue, maybe by leaving monetary policy too loose, actually generated the global financial crisis. I just wanted to show you a picture which just illustrates some of this. This is a picture of my kids' playroom. When my kids found out that I had a box of dinky cars which I'd kept from my youth, they were like fascinated and asked me to go and bring this stuff down from the loft, which I duly did, and tipped them all out on the floor. And it was like opening a time capsule, because first of all, I mean, some of these cars actually did look very dated. There was, I think, a Jaguar police car. You know, the ones where the sort of bonnet is about the same length as the boot? You know, those old ones. There was a Mini Metro. Less said about those, the better. I apologize to anyone in the audience who used to own one. You can probably see it in there. There was an A-Team van. That was pretty cool. There were some cars which actually hadn't changed a jot, or not very much, since this time. One of them was there was a 911 in there, which looks pretty much similar, the shape, as it does today. There was a Land Rover. There was a Bond car, a DB5, complete with ejector seat and a little chap in there which flew out. It was brilliant. But what fascinated me is I turned every one of them over and worked out where they were made. And 75% of those cars were made in England or Great Britain. Now, that staggered me, because if you look at the box of their cars they now have in their playroom, it's a very, very different mix. I think you'd probably struggle to find 1% of them made in the UK. And what happened was, this is exactly the point I was trying to make before, is that you were seeing more and more goods coming in from lower and lower cost economies, which generated this underlying current of deflation in goods. It meant that central banks could keep interest rates much lower than they needed to in normal times, and generate higher domestically generated inflation. So the last thing I wanted to say on inflation was, should central banks raise their inflation targets? Now, I have to warn you, for anyone who doesn't really fancy looking at charts or equations and things, this is the only one of these I've got in here. But I just wanted to illustrate why I think it would be a really, really bad idea to raise inflation rates. And the simple answer is this chart. This is a Phillips curve chart. And what it shows is, on the x-axis you have unemployment, on the y-axis you have inflation. And typically, over the short run, what you'd expect to see is a downward sloping line. So the lower is the unemployment rate, the higher is inflation. The more demand you've got in the economy, the hotter you run your economy, the lower the unemployment rate is, and it pushes up inflation. It's as simple as that. But it doesn't stop there. Let's imagine you're at point A, and this inflation number here is 2%. So we're starting at some equilibrium where unemployment is at equilibrium, inflation is at 2%, we're all very happy. And then the government says, why don't we increase the inflation target? How do you increase inflation to its target? Well, you provide more stimulus. You can lower interest rates, or you can provide fiscal support. And that will then raise well, it will lower unemployment because you've got more demand in the system, and it will push inflation up to this point here, point B. If things stopped there, every government in the world would do this. It would be a free option because all you need to do is accept a bit more inflation every year and you've got lower unemployment. Why would you not do that? Well, the reason you wouldn't do it is because things don't stop here. At this point here, the only reason why people are supplying more labour, why the unemployment rate is lower, is because they have seen that they have not realised that inflation has gone up. At the point in time when they realise inflation has gone up, they'll realise that their wages and inflation are actually the same, and they are still now supplying more labour for exactly the same level of real wages that they did before. And at that point, it dawns on them that they don't really like supplying more labour, given the fact they're not getting more pay for it. So what they say is, no, we're not accepting this, and you move out onto this higher short-run Phillips curve. So in other words, what happens if you try to increase the inflation rate, all you're doing is accepting a higher inflation rate, but your Phillips curve is vertical. The relationship between unemployment and inflation over the long run is vertical. You will simply move from point A to point C, and I don't think any government really wants to have to do that. So this is a sort of theoretical reason, and this is all work done by Milton Friedman back in the 1960s, for which he won a Nobel Prize in 1976. It's a very established theory and a good reason to think you shouldn't be raising your inflation target. So I wanted just to have a look on that basis. What are central banks now forecasting for inflation? And I think what's interesting, you very rarely find a central bank that forecasts that inflation is going to be above its target. Very, very rarely. I mean, why would you? If you're a central bank and you are tasked by your government to achieve a 2% inflation target, and you are given the tools to do so, why would you ever say that I think in 3 years' time, I'm not going to have achieved my job of getting inflation to target? You don't. So you often find that central banks typically forecast inflation in 3 years' time, or at some point in time in the future, will always return to target. And that's exactly what the ECB, the European Central Bank, is doing here. You can see that there's very, very rare occasions, and only those occasions they typically use it as a signalling device, but it's very rare that you see them saying, we don't think we're going to meet our inflation target. So how does a central bank go about forecasting inflation? I think there are three major things that they do. This is basically what we call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, DSGE models, which is a bit of a mouthful. Some people call them New Keynesian Phillips curve models. This is all, as I say, it's a lot of technical terms, but the easiest way to describe this is by using Bob Gordon's triangle model. This is a model that he developed in the 1970s, which said inflation depends on three things. And this is effectively how a central bank models inflation. The first thing it depends upon is inertia. In other words, where was inflation yesterday? Where do people think inflation is going to go? This is really important in generating inflation, actual inflation. The second thing is cost push on the very right-hand side. Now, cost-push inflation is all the stuff that you have very little control over. It could reflect an exchange rate shock. It could reflect energy price movements like we've seen over the past couple of years. But it's all stuff that an individual central bank of a small open economy, like the UK, cannot do anything about. It's all globally generated. What they can do a lot about is this thing in the middle, demand pull inflation. So inflation, which depends upon the output gap, it depends upon how hot you're running the economy relative to how much supply potential there is. If you're running your economy really hot and demand is running very high compared to supply, or unemployment is very low compared to its neutral interest, the neutral rate, that's what generates inflation. And so central banks are always using monetary policy to try and influence demand in the system in order to try and bring inflation back to its target. This chart just shows, it's not a very easy one to understand, but if you focus on the grey dots, that's very simple actually. It just shows where unemployment is relative to where it's been over the past, 20 years before the pandemic. And what it shows is that everywhere unemployment is much lower than where it has been. And I've put this chart on because the problem with looking at demand relative to supply is that you are trying to measure something which is basically unmeasurable. If you think about unemployment relative to its neutral or natural rate, who knows what the natural rate is? You have to estimate it. It's not observable. If you think about GDP relative to its trend, again, the trend rate of GDP is not observable. So you have to try and estimate the output gap. You have to try and estimate the unemployment gap, how far away these measures or these indicators are from where they should be to keep the economy in equilibrium. They're very, very difficult to estimate. And as a result of that, it's also very difficult to estimate where GDP is going to go. This is just showing a selection of forecasts right now for which economists and which forecasters think GDP is going to go in different directions. And you can see that it's quite a mess. I mean, there's a lot of very diverse expectations for economic growth. The Bank of England was recently subjected to a review by Ben Bernanke, who was a previous chair of the Federal Reserve. And he'd reviewed the Bank of England's forecasting process and said, look, it's not really ideal. You need to think about looking at the errors that you make in your forecasting and try to deduce why those errors happened and think about that in that way. Now, there is a great book which I should recommend anybody should read. It's called Super Forecasting by Tetlock and Gardner, a great book. I think it was written in about 2017. What they said is that experts were not really much better at forecasting than pretty much a random walk. And in fact, I think they said they weren't much better than forecasting than, I think they used the example of a dart-throwing monkey. Now, it does beg the question of why I exist and why I do this job for Nomura, but that's a different matter. But the consistent outperformance of forecasters was all due to people regularly reviewing their forecasts and making changes to those forecasts on an ongoing basis. And if you do that, you are much more likely to create better forecasts. The last thing I wanted to speak about is R star. Now, before you think I'm actually going to start off and talk about, this is going to turn into a lecture on astrophysics, you'll be very pleased to know I'm not talking about that R star, I'm talking about that R star, the equilibrium level of interest rates. Where are we going? You're probably getting an impression now that actually it's very difficult to forecast, and I think this probably gives you even more cause to think that. But the level of R star is something, it's the level of interest rates, whether you're looking at it in real terms, relative to inflation, or in nominal terms, it's the level of interest rates which will equate demand and supply. It's the level of interest rates which will ensure that inflation sits nicely at its 2% target and doesn't go up or down. That's the sort of number. The other point about R star is that it's a level of interest rates that can be defined across different terms. It could be across the long term or the short term. Where you'd set interest rates now versus where you might set interest rates in a few years' time. So there's lots and lots of moving parts about this. I think this is probably one of the best descriptions of it. That's the actual description of it. This is the best one. It's an invisible moving target. Very, very difficult to work out where R star is. You'll see a lot of central bankers who will say to you, well, we think that policy is too tight, we think it's too loose. And then you ask them the same question, where do you think R star is? And they won't answer that. But they have to have some internal view of where it is. Like a lot of things in economics, R star is a fantastic concept, but just putting numbers on it is almost impossible. But there's lots of reasons why we think that R star might have risen. That's these on the left-hand side. If you spend more, for example, on investment or fiscal policy, if you don't have as much savings in the past now as you did in the past, if you see deglobalization, for example, all of these things might push up the underlying rate of inflation and therefore might need you to increase the level of interest rates to keep inflation in check. But there's a number of things that might actually push R star downwards. One of them might be that the rate of economic growth is weaker, the potential growth rate. And if the potential economic growth rate is weaker, Think about arbitrage. Imagine you could borrow some money to invest in a basket of GDP. How much would you be willing to pay in interest to do that? Well, if your GDP growth rate was 3%, you wouldn't find many people who would want to borrow at rates of more than 3%, because you're obviously getting a return which is less. And equally so, if you could borrow at 2% but invest in the economy growing at 3%, everybody would want to do it if there was no risk involved. So that's why you typically expect R star to be somewhere close to the level of economic growth, generally speaking. This is what's actually happened to R star. I mean, it's a way of judging it, at least anyway. These are consensus forecasts I'm not even sure I can spell forecast. Consensus forecasts for 5 to 10 year ahead interest rates. And you can see that relative to just before the pandemic, they've risen by somewhere in the region of about 0.8 to 1 percentage points. So people think, or economists think, that R star has gone up. And this is what's happened to actual interest rates. This is a chart showing how many basis points. We would love to work in basis points rather than percentage points. But these are basis points increases in interest rates over the course of since they started rising in 2021. These are substantial increases in interest rates. I think it's worth just saying that the Bank of England, and all central banks do this, of course, these are the expectations of how much they think 0.5% on interest rates will have an impact on economic growth and on inflation at different points in the cycle. So they think that 0.5% on interest rates will trim inflation by about 0.2 percentage points. So you can do the maths and work out how much 500 basis points does. That's 10 times that. It should take about 2% off the rate of inflation. One of the big factors, of course, in higher interest rates, and they are expected to come down. I'll come on to that very shortly when I'm going to finish it. This is a chart of the UK housing market. It did make me think it looks like this structure in East London, this particular chart. It's actually a chart. This is the ArcelorMittal, what do they call it? I can't remember what they call it now. But it looks very similar. I thought I'd put it on there. This is a chart showing the recapitalisation and decapitalisation of the UK housing market. And just very briefly to explain, this is mortgage rates along the bottom. This is house prices up here. Down here was 1995. We had house prices which were very low and interest rates which were very high. And up here, we've gone to exactly the opposite position, where interest rates are now very low. Well, they were very low, at least at that point, and house prices were very high. The reason that house prices had to rise when interest rates went down was simple. If they didn't, your repayment to income ratio would have shifted a lot out of equilibrium. If you'd have just simply seen interest rates come down and nothing else, your repayment to income ratio would have been far too low. So what happened is house prices went up to equilibrate the system. The problem is that when we had the big rise in interest rates from 2021, that generated a disequilibrium in the housing market. We ended up here, and realistically, we should have been down here somewhere. Liz Truss didn't help at all, because that pushed interest rates even higher than they were back in 2022. And the combination of all of this means that we probably need to see more adjustment in the housing market. The good news is that housing market adjustment can come about not via the numerator, in other words, house prices falling. It can come about by wages rising and inflation rising as well, or at least prices rising. The combination of those two means that in real terms, your house prices will fall. You don't need to see a nominal adjustment, which is, for anyone who owns a house, very good news. And the other thing which can happen, of course, to bring house prices down, or at least can equilibrate the system, is that interest rates can fall. This chart shows how much interest rates are expected to fall across various large economies, Europe, UK and the US. They're expected to fall by about 150 basis points, 1.5% over the course of the next few years. If I'd put this chart on here about 2 months ago, it would have gone off through the floor. Expectations have changed drastically over the last couple of months simply because inflation looks far more sticky and central banks might take a lot longer to cut interest rates. So finally, some conclusions. First of all, Number one, recovery is happening. It's happening, but it's weaker than we might have expected. Number two, demographics, Brexit, and a number of other things are negatives for GDP, but a combination of AI in the near term and longer term, but also climate change in the longer term might actually be good for the economy. Third, there is a big debate about whether inflation is going to go back to pre-pandemic norms or lows, or whether it's going to stay sticky. And central banks, and we still do not know the answer to that. It's a big source of economic debate. On economic forecasting, I think that leaves a lot to be desired, and I say that as an economic forecaster. As I say, it does question why economists exist, but there are lots of lessons to be learned about how we can improve our economic forecasting, including checking our own forecasts against actually what happened and trying to understand why those errors happened. And finally, long-run equilibrium interest rates, I think, are going to be higher than where they were, but it may be the case that that constrains growth by more than we expect. I think that's all I had to say. Thank you very much for coming today and listening. I think we've got a bit of time for, probably less time than I was anticipating. I just see is it 5 to 7? Gosh, I do apologise for speaking for so long, but I think we've got about 5 minutes for Q&A. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming and listening. Thanks very much. Thank you.
So we have a little bit of time for questions. If you could wait until we get the microphone to you so that everybody can hear the question, that would be really helpful. So any questions? Marion.
Diolch, George. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was particularly interested in that photo you showed of your car collection back in the 70s. And although I think most of us aware that the car making industry has contracted greatly in the UK, I think that was a very powerful statement, actually. I don't think any of us had really appreciated how far it had contracted. And during that same period, we've seen the demise of our traditional industries, coal, steel making, and we know the service industries have grown in parallel. I wonder, could you tease out the impact of that? It's clearly had an impact on GDP, but perhaps you could tease out a bit more of the impact of the demise of those traditional industries.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes back to the point I made about David Ricardo and the idea that you should focus on what you think that you can produce more effectively and better. Not necessarily than other countries, but ones that you can produce better using the resources that you have. And if you think you can produce services better, which we think we can, then I don't think it's a bad thing that we are focusing on those things. One of the big problems, I think, and this goes to, it doesn't make a difference whether you're producing services or goods, is that you need to be very careful about having all your eggs in one basket. If you are set up as a manufacturing country like Germany is, or you are a financial services country like the UK is, you are much more exposed to shocks in those parts of the economy. So, for example, Germany, much more exposed to China, much more exposed to the global manufacturing cycle. And UK, obviously, much more exposed to financial crises, which is why we did not perform particularly well during the global financial crisis of 2007 to 09. We had a much bigger hit to economic output. So I think the big lesson to be learned is, for sure, we need to focus on things that we can produce better and more efficiently and effectively. But we also need to have in mind that we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, it's not really a question. It's more of a, can I just check that this is right? Yeah, you were saying that economic forecasters don't compare their previous forecasts with what actually happened. Is that right? I mean, because that seems like a pretty fundamental thing that I just assumed they did.
We absolutely do. The difference was in this book on super forecasting, which I probably should have spent a little more time talking about, is that the forecasters who did best were constantly reviewing their forecasts every single day, sometimes multiple times per day. And so what they did in super forecasting is ask a group of forecasters they asked them various questions about what do you think is going to happen with various political and economic events. And what they would do is provide a probability. And that probability, some of them would change daily, sometimes even hourly. And the people who changed their probability the most in relation to what news was coming out did the best. Unfortunately, economists don't like changing their forecast that regularly. The Bank of England provides forecasts once every quarter. We update ours every week, but these guys were updating them almost in real time. So the argument was that the more you change your forecast, the better it is. The other point is, the more you change your forecast, the less of a story you might have, and the less people will be inclined to believe you. If I now come up and say I'm going to change something I've just told you this evening, you might be less inclined to believe my story. So I think there's a balance to be had with how many times you do this and how many times you change your forecast. But Bernanke's review of the Bank of England was pretty scathing. And it didn't like the idea of the use of fan charts, which it uses to try and explain the risks to its forecast. It says, hey, we think 90% of outcomes will fall for inflation, maybe 1% and 6%. I mean, is that useful? Possibly, possibly not. But it does show the uncertainty in forecasting. But yeah, it's a good point. And, we all do change our forecasts. We'll check them regularly and work out why we've got it wrong. But maybe we don't spend enough time on checking why they're wrong versus actually creating those forecasts in the first place.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, we've got one here. Thank you.
Do you think that government intervention has been a good thing or a bad thing? And has it been? Has it been good or bad in the past?
Government intervention. Yeah, I mean, some governments have intervened more than others and in different ways. I guess if you look at how the governments intervened back in 2007, those interventions were absolutely critical to save the economy. There were, obviously banks, which if you'd left everything to unfettered market forces, you would have potentially lost a substantial portion of your banking sector. So in that case, yes. But then there are other types of intervention, like fiscal intervention. We've seen that quite substantially over the course of the last few years. Liz Truss's fiscal intervention, I think probably we can all safely agree, was not a good idea. Mr. Hunt's fiscal intervention after that probably was, in which he tightened fiscal policy. So I think there's different, and of course you can go back to 2010 to 15 when there was substantial fiscal tightening, fiscal austerity. I think the jury is out on that. Some people think it's been a good idea, but some people think it's been bad. There are so many different types of intervention from governments, and some I think are more needed than others. But I think the IMF is right in saying that people have to be very careful in loosening fiscal policy at this stage, where we might not have that much room to do so. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Oh yeah, got one.
There we are. I'm less interested in the numbers and more interested in the effect it has on people. And I'm not an economist, as this question will no doubt suggest, but it just strikes me that a lot of the theories you pointed at there and where some graphs come from are all kind of 70s stuff, aren't they? 50 years ago, and that they were created by people who grew up during the time of prime capitalism, the birth of neoliberalism, etc. And I just wonder, here we are these 40 to 50 years later, and as you set out, the economies are tanking, there's lots of problems about, we've seen inequalities particularly high, the rich are getting richer, the poorer are getting the picture. Should we be analysing and forecasting based on some new kind of policy and theory bases that have learnt from those last 50 years, or should we keep going back to these basic economic models?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think you're right. I mean, there was some stuff in there, of course, which I talked about, which were substantially, earlier than that, 1700s and 1800s in the case of Smith and Ricardo. But yeah, I think we've learned a lot since the 1970s, and the fact that central banks are more credible now, they have the tools that they can achieve their inflation targets, means that most people now believe that they will achieve their inflation targets. And that credibility, if you remember that those three things that central banks use to forecast inflation expectations, credibility, and where inflation's just come from, are all super important in determining where inflation comes from. You can't get away from the fact that if you run your economy too hot, you are going to generate inflation if you haven't got the supply potential which goes with it. So all of those things are still very relevant. The big difference now is that in section 1 of that sort of forecasting model, the inflation expectations and credibility, the central banks now have a lot more credibility than they did in the 1970s, when there was no guarantee that they were going to do something to stop inflation, even if it wasn't generated by a supply shock. These days, I think there's a lot more assumption that so you can use the same model, it's just that you have to make slightly different assumptions, and one of those is about central bank credibility. Is it right that they should target 2% inflation? I mean, going back to that point about the 1960s, absolutely. If you can't keep your prices under control, you don't have an effective monetary system. So I think it's really important that they do. I mean, after all, why would you? Some people think that it's a good idea to have a GDP target. The problem with that is nobody knows. You could have, for example, a GDP target. Let's say we're aiming for 2% GDP every year. What happens if your underlying potential growth rate is 0? Should you really be trying to run your economy at 2% and generating inflation on the back of it? I think not. I think it's a much better idea to have the nominal target of inflation as opposed to a real target of GDP when you simply do not know what your economy is capable of doing. If it's not capable of running at those rates, you shouldn't be pushing it above those rates. So in some senses, I think that the theories of the past are still absolutely right, but they just need to be considered in the framework of more credible central banking.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Hello. I was going to ask about, do you know how you were saying the goods have decreased in the UK? Do you think that's something that's happened because the UK have allowed it to happen, or do you think it's kind of been stolen, not stolen, but, the foreign markets or the producers have moved abroad and we've kind of lost them, or did we allow it to happen? And also, do you think because of Brexit now, we're going to see a further decrease in the manufacturing that's produced in England?
Yeah, so a couple of very interesting questions. In terms of Brexit, I think it is having a negative economic impact. And as I say before, this is not, I don't want to say this and sound like this is a political statement, because it definitely is not. I can tell you when just for complete clarity, when I walked into the polling booth back in the 23rd of June of 2016, I stood there with the pencil in my hand for 10 minutes, not knowing how to vote. That is from an economist who knew what the impact of Brexit was going to be. And I was kicking. We're talking about learning from mistakes and errors. In your question, this is precisely what I wish now I'd thought about this, because I should have been forecasting that this was going to be an exit from the EU. Because if somebody like me, as a trained economist, can stand there and not know how to vote, there was going to be a lot of other people who would have voted out, not caring about the impact it had on the economy. So I think that was quite an interesting. But I think Brexit is going to have a negative impact or is having a negative impact on growth. As I mentioned, if you look at exports and imports as a proportion of GDP and track how they've been moving relative to other countries, and of course one of the big problems is that Brexit happened at exactly the same time as the pandemic. So it's very difficult to disentangle the two. The only way you can disentangle them is to look at what happened to the UK versus other countries, all of whom experienced exactly the same thing, apart from Brexit. Now, there might be other reasons which we haven't accounted for, but it does look like there is a negative impact. The Bank of England thinks it's going to be over a much longer period that negative impact is felt. And your first question was about, sorry, just to get the mic back, it was about inflation, about deflation, wasn't it?
Well, no, it was more kind of the car example that you used, and the fact that now a lot less is produced in the UK. Do you think that happened because the UK were moving to different like markets and different ways to produce, or did China kind of take that from us because they have a better manufacturing kind of setup in their country?
I think it was purely because of globalization and the fact that in a globalized world, why would you not go and buy from the best manufacturer, and why would you not come to the best producer of services, which is the UK? So it just goes back to this Ricardo point that you might as well specialize in the stuff that you can do best. And you can do that much more easily when you have globalization. You can't do it when you can't trade with other countries. But when you can, you might as well just focus on what you can do best. And we are not particularly good. Although, that said, I think some of these cars were fantastic, made back in the 70s, but we are not good at making stuff relative to other countries. That is a big generalization. Of course, we are great at doing some stuff. Pharmaceuticals, for example, huge business. But we are much, and we've seen this in the university space. I mean, we are great at exporting education. We've seen it especially in Bangor. We are not as good as producing stuff as we are providing services. And that's why I think you've seen this balance tip from 30% of the economy being manufactured goods back in the 70s to today, when globalization allows us to trade a lot more easily. So we've just simply gone to the stuff that we do best.
Thank you. We'll make this the final question. Thank you.
Particularly in regards to sort of mortgages and house prices, if you were in our position of sort of graduating this year, would you be more likely to stay in the UK or move to an economy like New Zealand or Australia, which is a little bit more accessible?
Thinking about house prices, so in terms of saying that you think house prices are too high?
Yeah, so like the availability for young people to like get onto the property market.
Yeah.
Obviously, lots more people are renting now. Do you think that's likely to improve, or do you think, are there any reasons why it would improve as opposed to just getting worse?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always hope that the last question is going to be an easy one, but clearly that's not. So would I suggest you should move to New Zealand? The housing market, look, it looks overvalued. So on that chart I showed, the sort of messy red chart, it looks overvalued, largely because of where interest rates are and where house prices are right now, where incomes are right now. It definitely looks overvalued. For young people, it's really difficult to get on the property ladder. Will it improve? I think it probably will for a few reasons. In the near term, most people are expecting that interest rates are going to go down. And I think you are looking probably at 1.5% lower interest rates over the course of the next couple of years. So that's a positive. Secondly, we have a new government, likely, that's what the polls are telling us, later this year. They may decide that they want to produce more housing. Now, the more supply you get relative to demand, that should push prices down. But what's really important is the stock. It's been years and years of less building and more demand, which means that it's going to take a long time to erase that. You're not going to do it with just an extra 300,000 units built in 1 year. It's going to take many years to get that down. So I think the issue of supply but interest rates, I think, will be helpful. I think everything on balance is going to help push prices down relative to incomes. But I think it's going to take a long time to get to where I expect you would like to see it.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, George. That was absolutely fascinating. A really, really great talk. Can we all give George another big round of applause?
Thank you.